Welcome. This is Discovering the Blue Hour author writing podcast. In today's episode, we will explore the pros and cons, review and analyze the most recent and newest Teen Wolf movie. This review will contain spoilers, so stay tuned. Hi, welcome back. This is the Blue Hour, and you are listening to the Discovering the Blue Hour podcast. This is an author writing podcast where I talk about writing topics pertaining to not only my work in progress werewolf novel during the Blue Hour, but also werewolf and wolf mythology pertaining to TV topics, tropes, reviews, and more. Okay, so I haven't recorded full podcast episodes since last year, and I ended it with an episode 10, which was about the origins of Little Red Riding Hood. And the last time I did a pop culture TV movie review about werewolves was last year as well. I did a brief review analysis of the Deaton TV show, and both episodes of this podcast will be in the top above in the video. So now, today I've decided I'm going to have an episode about Teen Wolf, the movie. Okay, and even though I love this franchise, I will be analyzing it from a screenwriter's perspective, since that's what I am, a screenwriter and writer. So please don't think anything of it if I delve deep and analyze it too critically. I still love this franchise, okay? Teen Wolf is one of my favorite TV shows about werewolves. When it first aired in 2011, I was so psyched but a little bit wary due to the fact it is literally the same name of the 1980s Teen Wolf movie, which I loved watching reruns of in the 90s. Even though they kept the best friend's name, everything else about Teen Wolf was changed and I liked it. Teen Wolf, at the time of its first airing, had everything that some other supernatural teen TV shows didn't have, especially the werewolf lore, and I was all for it, and I followed the characters and the stories all the way up to season 6. And even though season 4 to 6 were not as good as season 1 to 3, I still liked it. So yeah, I always hoped for the continuation of Teen Wolf and hope they continue past season 6. So, when they announced a movie of Teen Wolf, once again, I was psyched. And though I was a little late knowing when it was going to come out, I was definitely all for it. When the trailer dropped, I shared it. I had my reserves about it, but I was still excited because, it's Teen Wolf. I didn't really mind the STILES wasn't in it. I like the character, don't get me wrong. I'll talk more about that a little later. But I was intrigued to see how they would do the storyline of the movie without him and bringing back Allison. How is they going to do it? This is what made me psyched about the trailer when it was announced. I didn't even know it was already out until a couple of weeks ago, because even though I followed the announcement of it's premiering, I'm not that type to follow the show like that, but I still loved it. And so when I realized it was out, I really got excited. I watched it twice. And okay. My first watch of the opening scene was very confusing. And I was like, who are these people? My second rewatch of the opening scene, I was still kind of confused. And still it took me a minute to come to believe that Liam, who, although not a main character in the series, was supposed to be suddenly the keeper of the Nakasune spirit. I always saw him as a side character since he came almost around the last 2 seasons. But it felt kind of jarring to see him in the very opening scene of the movie, but he really has nothing to do with the movie. He is merely a side character whose story arc in this movie adds nothing to the story itself. In fact, this very scene did not have to be at the very opening of the movie. The scene is misplaced and seems almost out of order. We could have been reintroduced to the threat, which was non-Kitsune, in a different way before the first act. And in the second act of the movie is established as the inciting incident. The ambience of the scene was very dark and gritty and compared to the opening scene of season 1. I couldn't really see what was going on in the scene. It didn't feel inviting or make me want to continue watching. And the pacing of the scene itself was also jarring and too fast-paced yet boring at the same time. They started the scene off in an environment that we weren't even familiar with in the TV show. It took me as the viewer out of the experience of what Teen Wolf the movie is supposed to be. For me, the fan, even at the opening scene, even though I know who Liam is, I, as the viewer, don't know who the other characters are. And I didn't really care. And on another note, why do we see reintroduction of a dead teacher who didn't have anything to do with any of the story in this opening scene? I'll talk more about him later. Okay, so the second scene opens during the daytime, and we finally see what's happening in the actual scene, but it opens with Deaton at an undisclosed location, possibly close to Beacon Hills, where a little girl and her dog is trapped in a building that is about to collapse. Apparently, there had been some attempts to save the girl, but her dog wouldn't let anyone near them and bit the firefighter or whatnot. Okay, but then Deaton said, okay, I called someone, and the firefighter was like, who? And Deaton says, the Alpha. I'm going to pause here and say, this very one part of the opening scene is very problematic, much like the initial opening scene. Here is why. First of all, even though Deaton is a character we love, he's the second known character we see after the opening scene. But still, again, he is not the main character that I thought I would want to see. And its scene is also still very problematic because it is still jarring. I don't know where the scene is, the situation we are in, but only until we hear Deaton say and mention of the Alpha that I know any indication that he meant Scott. For all I know, it could have been another Alpha. Then the line to me seems corny in a way. It doesn't seem believable that firefighters would call Deaton Scott for help when they are merely working at an animal shelter, even if there was a dog attack. And the situation itself for an opening scene seems a little over the top for a movie of a series that we know a lot about already. The scene itself has no connection to the other scenes within the movie and doesn't solidify that Scott and Deaton go through these kind of predicaments on the daily. It seems bland and out of place considering the supernatural issues that they already have been through. I was also wondering, when did Scott become Superman? Because he's in that scene seems less like a werewolf and more like Superman. And then after Scott saved the girl, the scene just ends with Deaton once again mentioning Scott as an alpha, not a dog, but a wolf. Therefore, the opening scene lasted for 7 minutes, 38 seconds. And even though it established the threat of the Nakasune, it didn't solidify, in my opinion, any nostalgia until. I love the opening credits. I love the animation opening credits where it had kind of a Walking Dead feel to it. This topped my nostalgia off with the same theme song from the Teen Wolf TV show, but in violin orchestra. And it brought me back to the TV series. And because of this intro, I forgot about the terrible, hard to watch opening scene. But then this happened. Okay, so Act 1 opens up as they get back to the clinic at night, where the scene goes back to the horrible, dark, and gritty atmosphere that we had at the opening scene. I guess hours after saving little girl. To me, it felt reminiscent of the scene's first episode of the first season of Teen Wolf. In fact, it was one of the scenes literally, except that Allison was dead and Scott didn't really see her knock on the door. In addition to this, a few seconds later, Argent Allison's father appears out of nowhere within the scene and claims he has seen her too. Okay, so trouble with this particular scene was, I feel like this scene right here should have been the opening scene for the movie. I'll explain why later. My question and confusion already within the 10-minute, 29-second mark is, why is Scott all of a sudden seeing Allison after 15 years? Had he seen her up to the point when she died in the show? The show never mentioned this before throughout all the seasons. The problem with this particular scene and why it didn't work where it should have was there is no clear reason to why he is seeing these visions of Allison. In fact, briefly after the scene, the whole "we saw Allison in a vision" is altogether dropped and replaced by a brief explanation about seeing a word, bardo, in a dream. That is what they say is merely a concept that means nothing. And instead, they don't try to find out why they just automatically jump to a ritual that has to be done by the full moon to bring her back. It's weird because it's been 15 years. Why would they want to bring her back? The word I forgot was mentioned in season 3 story arc with Void Styles and the Nakasune. But this word and any connection to Allison's arc, wouldn't in turn make sense because her second death wasn't a sacrificial one that pertained to the Nebaton. The ritual consists of the sword that killed Allison, the dirt from the place she was killed, and the Nebaton tree itself on the full moon. So to make a long story short, within this act, Scott goes back to Beacon Hill, reunites with members of his pack, and by the end of Act 1, Allison is alive. But this doesn't work in a story sense at all for a 2-hour movie. Maybe if it was fleshed out a little bit more and the movie was about this one thing, but it's not there. Are of course 2 other storylines that they interconnect with this Allison story arc. The other 2 story arcs, as you well know, is the introduction of Derrick's son, and the other story arc is the one of the Nakasune. The reintroduction of the Nakasune, where it is connected with Allison and her father, Argent, towards the end of this Act 1 in the movie doesn't make sense because throughout the movie, there is no clear indication or connection to her and the Nakasune or why she was resurrected in the first place. When the Nakasune was released by an unknown figure teacher at the beginning, it had this plan all along to go to Argent, forcing and putting it in his mind to awaken Allison. But how does that explain Scott seeing the visions of Allison? The second story arc that was introduced in Act 1 was, like I said, the introduction of Derrick's son, Eli, at the 17-minute and 40-second mark. This plays out as a story C, but in my opinion, the introduction to Eli's storyline should have played a way bigger part in this movie. I mean, it's called Teen Wolf for a reason, right? I'll talk more about the Eli and Derrick storyline later because it's a bigger part of my video and some issues and plot holes I'd like to discuss. Act 2, Resurrection. My opinion about where Act 2 begins is the scene at the hospital where Allison is finally awoken and all she thinks about is going after Derrick. Scott and the rest are trying to wrap their head around that she is actually existing after 15 years. She mostly tries to hunt down Derrick. These 2 scenes are interspliced by the resurrection of the actual physical Nakasune at the Nebaton tree, who tricks Allison by pretending to be her dead mother. And Allison goes after Derrick and injures him bad, nearly killing him. She then goes after Scott instead while the others fight against the Oni in this second act, Derrick trying to hold on to his life. Okay, I'm going to stop right here and discuss what's wrong with this first half of the second act. It spends too much time on Allison without explaining why and how she is actually there. Therefore, her resurrection in Act 2 doesn't make an ounce of sense, neither does her supernatural combat. Doesn't make sense, and it's not really explained. I can understand the amnesia, and I wish they had used that more in her story arc, which they did to a certain point, but then they just dropped it towards the end of the second act. Allison going after Derrick also doesn't make sense, because she wasn't in the state of mind when she died in season 3. She was never going after Derrick. So why was she in that state of mind, even though she was a hunter when she was resurrected? She had already gotten over the death of her aunt by the time she died in season 3, and didn't really have any grievances with Derrick. Nakasune is also resurrected in this act too. Wasn't the Nakasune brought back at the start of the movie without the Nebuton tree? This part was kind of confusing to me since I didn't think we needed to see his resurrection twice. I mean, he already inhabited Argent at the start of the movie, as we already know. And so, it is unclear how it was even possible that he needed Allison to be reborn or whatnot. It wasn't explained in Act 1. The Oni killed Allison in season 3, not the Nakasune, and that makes her supernatural. And Allison wasn't supernatural, even if you want to say, well, she was brought back to life, and that makes her supernatural. It's not true. Once again, the movie does not delve into and really explain anything behind why she is there. We can only make assumptions. The simple fact that the Nakasune could even trick Allison in seeing her dead mother and convince her to turn on Scott and the pack is preposterous, even without her memories. I really wanted to see and get some interesting scenes that could have probably tied the Nebuton tree, into Deaton and the Druids. That would have been an interesting storyline, since we didn't see that, the series itself explained. Also, in the first half of Act 2, is the storyline of how supernatural creatures being drawn to Beacon Hills because of the Nebuton tree is back, but just a second within a scene at the police station where the Nakasune needs to get the tales of an unknown Kitsune who is an officer, and so he pretends he is an actual person and ends up basically killing him for his tales, but mentions to him before he kills the officer he is one. Okay, I see the Nakasune being around Beacon Hills for revenge, but also for this storyline alone because it's pretty interesting and it could have worked well if fleshed out and explored more. The second half of Act 2 had Allison hunting down Eli while the others are defeated by the Oni. Derrick is saved by Scott, his impending death being a fake out at this point. Scott having to go save Eli because, I will explain soon more, but then Eli gets away and then Allison chases Scott until she injures him. Her father, Scott's mother, and Derrick's uncle Peter goes looking for Allison. While this is going on, the Uni sends the whole pack to a place that I would say wasn't really ever explored in the series itself, and they're just being held there for most of the rest of the second act, along with Derrick trapped by roots or whatnot. It turns out that they are underneath the playing field of the country lacrosse game that was taking place. Allison ends up saving Scott, and Scott goes on to the playing field where he sees Eli, and they get swept up within the game and have to play while his whole pack sits underneath the field. Oh yeah, Lydia, Michaela, and Jackson. They find their way to the stadium and unmask the unknown figure that apparently unleashed the Nakasune in the first place. Unknown figure is a person from their past, which appeared throughout season 1 to 3, and that is their science teacher. I'll talk more about him later, but he has apparently put up this barrier between the field and the bleachers made up of the mountain ash, where no supernatural creature, especially werewolves, can get out or in. But somehow, Lydia and Parrish break it with her scream and Parrish's hellhound power, which I wish was a little bit more explored. Scott and Allison and Eli are able to go where all the other members of the pack are. Another long story short, Allison is able to remember all her memories due to Lydia's banshee scream. As I watched this half of the second act, I felt it was kind of also wasted yet again on Allison's story arc. The storylines of the Nakasune is a weak shadow of his former self from seasons 3, and its storyline is buried and shoved along with all the others beneath the Nebaton tree. We still haven't learned anything new about Nagasune. Yes, he wants revenge, but his revenge is nothing more than a mere game of nonsensical riddles and useless talk without any action. The Oni and the are the only ones doing anything, but their background is not even explored further from the series either. He's just standing there, blabbing away, and all that time the characters could have somehow come up with a plan to get away without Scott and Allison, yet they are just standing useless like totem poles. The lacrosse game and Scott's participation in it felt out of place and not needed. Why did it have to take place surrounded by the field? And didn't the humans know this was all going on? We'll talk more about that later. Act 3, Illusions. With Allison's memory back, she doesn't seem to fight anymore. I guess her arc was concluded here, but is thus taken over by Scott, Eli, and Derrick as they soon come to face the illusions placed on them by the Nakasune, who creepily says the game is his as he holds Eli ready to attack him. Okay, I guess. Everybody continues to stand there as the Nakasune just continues to talk as he has been doing the whole movie. Scott agrees to take an arrow to win the so-called game Nakasune is playing. So Allison, it seems, has one more task, which is to strike Scott with the arrow, which she doesn't want to, but Scott tells her to go ahead. It soon appears he has died, but Scott says he is not ready to die, and tricks the Nakasune by using Liam's fox girlfriend's fire to stop his impending death. Don't really know her name, but she was used as a plot device that didn't need to be in there, but okay. Jackson, after all this time, finally manages to injure the teacher. Scott's mom, Argent, and Peter kill the Uni, injure Nakasune with silver. The pack is just once again fighting more Uni. The Nakasune revels the pack with his presence again by talking about the fight Scott gave him in season 3. And so he turns into this hideous werewolf creature, ripping off the mask or face. But the thing is, this doesn't even look like a werewolf. He makes this hideous roar, and you see this hilarious few seconds of Scott squirming like, dude. But then he, Derrick, and Eli turn into the werewolf while the others stand by. Okay. Nagasune makes another roar. First of all, when do werewolves roar? But okay. They go after the Nakasune and they get swept in his illusion, but separated from each other. They find each other and they fight the Nakasune one by one. It's kind of gruesome, but in a weird slow motion kind of way. And they suddenly all find themselves back at the Nebaton tree. Parrish takes over from there, lights the Nakasune up, but also taking Derrick out in the process. Derrick is presumed dead. Eli loses his father. The pack loses their friend. But hey, Allison is still alive and has survived. They remember Derrick. Eli gets STILES' car, whereas throughout the whole movie, they didn't want to give to him for some weird reason. The teacher survives, gets taken to Eachin house, and we end with a final shot of Eli with eyes lighting up yellow. Okay, the only thing I liked about this ending was how Parrish took the Nakasune out, because we finally see him sort of using his powers differently. than it was from the series. He kind of has accepted more and is somewhat an in focus to the movie than it in the series. The illusion scenes were well played out in these final scenes. However, the werewolf transformations were minimum, and I'm going to talk more about that later. Characters and confusing story arc. All the characters except for STILES, we'll talk more about that later, made an appearance or cameo in the movie. Okay, what I wanted to know was what happened to Isaac? He was a favorite and then he just disappeared. Other than that, it seemed like the cast was all there. After years from the show not airing, all the characters seemed to well be just as we left them at the end of season 6, if you exclude the 15-year time jump. I know this is just the movie, but I felt some things were missing from the storylines of some of the characters between season 6 and the 15-year time jump. All the characters seemed displaced or thrown into the scene without any real purpose except for Scott and Allison. I kind of had a problem with this because, okay, they had storylines with plot holes that could have been expanded, but they were just wasted, forgotten, or unnecessary. Like, when did Jackson become so well versed in solving puzzles? He kind of fell out of character from what he was in the 2 seasons he was on Teen Wolf. Correct me if I'm wrong about his character. It kind of felt off to me, and then I was kind of upset because throughout the whole movie, he didn't do anything. He didn't transform, not even a hint of his cool eye color changey thing he did in season 2. Okay, after the second rewatch, I saw the cool eye changey thing, but it was only for a split second. I wanted to see his character get a little exploring, since we got nothing of his character really since he went off to London. But we got nothing, even though he was supposedly the comic relief. And then he just randomly popped in out of nowhere, it seemed strange. At what point was Allison's father Argent possessed by the evil Kasune, and when? Same question during the second rewatch. Another great character, he was misused and misplaced, and I wanted to see more of the effects of having his daughter back after 15 years. What happened to him and Scott's mother? That wasn't explained, even though it was quickly mentioned in brief dialogue about not seeing her for some time. And it seemed weird that none of the characters noticed there was something wrong with Argent besides Deaton. Let's talk about Deaton for a minute. Deaton is another character misused and wasted. I was waiting to see more sciencey or supernatural explanation stuff from him, and giving more knowledge about the Nakasuni to the pack. Like I mentioned before, I wish there was a storyline that involved him, Allison, and the Druids, and the Nebaton tree, and it would have been more in sync to why Allison existed now. Peter, yet again, another great character, not really used for anything like Jackson. He popped in out of nowhere. You could see they were trying to set up a brief storyline and tension with him possibly killing Allison, but that went nowhere, and him basically became a background character like all the rest. He didn't even transform. I will talk more about the transformations later. Malia was just there, it seemed. Didn't really do anything except stick to Parrish like glue. And I'm guessing they were in some sort of relationship, which was odd and not really explained very well. What happened between her and Scott? That was hinted but never explained. I would have loved to know, but she was the only one that fully transformed into a were-coyote near the beginning of the movie. Yet, it had nothing to do with the threats that the pack faced. Parrish, hell. So, like I Said before, I liked the development at the end where Parrish destroyed the Nakasune, but yet again his story arc is missing completely, and it felt thrown together just to save the day. I thought finally we would get to see his mythos in the movie since they never delved deep into the hound in the series as much as I liked. But yet again, we got nothing but relationship woes and plot devices. Scott. Even though he was the main character, he didn't really do anything. He wasn't the one to save the day. He was in the action, but all he did was get hurt or chase after. I feel like his character was wasted, even though he was able to get Allison back in the end. And he was supposedly all about Allison still after 15 years. That to me wasn't believable. Why did he suddenly have visions of Allison after all these years? I know he never truly moved on, but it just seemed he just had his job and that was it. There was only a hint about his broken relationships with Styles, Derrick, Lydia, his mother, and Malia, but it was never explained. And I wished it would have went more in depth with that. All the things we liked about Scott, even though it was there, it's like he couldn't live until he had Allison back at the end. And hints to that at the end scene with him and Allison are finally together. Allison. Allison was the character who died 15 years ago and came back to life in the movie. Her resurrection in this movie is unexplainable. That's what makes her existence somewhat confusing for me as a viewer. It never goes into detail about how she is there. Her amnesia storyline was also short-lived, which I liked, but wish they would have delved more into that and the significance of Bardo. The way she was all about killing Derrick as soon as she woke up didn't make sense to her character. Like I said earlier, when she died, she wasn't in the mindset to go after Derrick. Therefore, logically speaking, she shouldn't have woken up in that particular mindset. Did she have a connection with the Nakasune, which therefore allowed him to manipulate her to be that way when she woke up? If her connection allowed him with the Nakasune was further developed, then I can understand her mindset better and behind her motivations and why she was doing the things she did. After the initial resurrection, and it seemed when she got her memory back, there was nothing left for her character to do. She wasn't a threat anymore, but I don't think her arc should have lasted as long as it did. Lydia, one of the main characters throughout this whole series, her character arc and story plot was just sidelined, and the short explanation of why they gave her not going full ranch was just not satisfying enough and kind of rude since she was obviously one of the best characters to ever exist in the show. Like and comment if you agree. I would love to hear your thoughts about the character Lydia. Personally, I always thought they could have done a spinoff with her as the main character, discovering everything about being a banshee. She could most definitely hold her own without STILES or Scott. I would have loved to see what she was up to between Team Year Time Jump. Some questions were, was that her company? How close had she been with Scott? I noticed some chemistry between them in the movie. Was there some sort of disagreement between Lydia, Scott, and STILES? The science teacher. So the science teacher was killed off in the TV series around season 3, I believe, but he has managed to make a cameo in the movie. My question was why? Why though? And how did he manage to come back to life? That was never explained in the movie, and apparently was first introduced at the beginning of the movie. He wasn't important and like some of the other characters should have never even been back for the movie like Liam. His presence in the movie made no sense. How did he even know about the Nakasune in the first place? This made no sense, that he would track him down. The Nakasune didn't even help him, so I felt like these scenes were wasted, where actual substantial plotlines should have been. Sheriff STILINSKY. Sheriff STILINSKY, Styles' father, was brought back in the movie, but like the other characters, he was just there in the midst of the two storylines. The Nexuni and Derrick and Eli's story. I understand him being there fighting against the Uni because he's the sheriff, but him being mixed up in Derrick and Eli's storyline makes no sense at all to me. And I don't say this to be mean, because I liked his character in the series and I was glad he was back for the movie, but something didn't sit right with me and why he would be so involved with Eli's life. I'm going to talk more about this later and why. Derrick is a character that was brought back in the movie, and yet again a character who was misused and misplaced within this movie, whereas him and his son storyline should have been the A or B storyline of the movie, and I will explain why very soon. However, in this movie, he is apparently somehow living back in Beacon Hills after 15 years, settled in a house and owning an auto garage shop supposedly, and supposedly has a 15-year-old son who cannot turn into a werewolf and appears to be socially awkward. This should have been a focus to this teen wolf movie, but okay. The character arc and storyline for Derrick in this movie is kind of confusing and doesn't feel right from what we know about Derrick and what he has been through in his life. I wouldn't take Derrick as a character who would want to go back to Beacon Hills and settle down, especially after what happened to his own family throughout the series itself. The last time we see him in season 6, he's on the run. To me, it didn't seem plausible and it felt forced for a couple of reasons. We don't see any pictures mentioned of the woman he settled down with or what happened to her, not even a private moment, flashbacks, or memory. There was ample opportunity to flesh this out. The sense of him having a son feels rushed and incomplete and thrown together. There is no father-son chemistry or dynamic between the two. Eli is socially awkward, something that Derrick wasn't that way when he was in school. I saw them as being very awkward. Yet again, there are no flashbacks or memories of his son growing up with him. It was very jarring, and the guilt he struggles with for his son not turning into a werewolf felt unexplored, rushed, and not making sense for the storyline itself. I had expected something much more substantial to why Eli couldn't transform, and then he was just standing there until the end besides his almost death in Act 2. When he finally died at the end of Act 3, that even felt out of place, and his death didn't make sense either. But wondering if he is actually still alive because of his eyes color changing back to the alpha color red. Well, I don't know. Overall, for Derrick, his character in the movie felt like a waste, an afterthought. I wanted to see more from him, especially in the fight against Allison in Act 2. Of course, he was unaware by her presence, but there's no way he couldn't have survived that fight and unable to take her down. He was too weak in this movie, and he is not a weak character. It's like the writers didn't know what to do with his character or anyone's character in the movie. Eli. Okay, now I'm talking about Eli. Finally, he is the son of Derrick, a new character that was introduced in the movie. And along with his father, his storyline is storyline C. My first impression of his character seemed okay, not too bad for a new character introduced for a movie series franchise. And they did well with it, but not quite, because the setup of Eli as a character was all wrong and misplaced, like much of the story and character arcs in the movie. I do find him likable, and if written well next time, he could possibly take the mantle from Scott as the new teen wolf. But the problem lies in this movie is, like I said before, they didn't set the character up correctly. The whole him being the next teen wolf would work out really well since he wasn't a bitten teen wolf like Scott. He was born a wolf. So that would work well to see his ups and downs and struggles in schools facing new adversaries, and to create, build, or find his own path and be the alpha of that path. However, his storyline in the movie is overshadowed and taken over from the presence of Allison's storyline. I saw where the writers were possibly trying to mirror him with Scott, trying to accept being a werewolf like Scott did in season 1. But this fell short. It wasn't really fleshed out and believable because we don't know Eli yet what he wants and needs. It would have worked if it was fleshed out a little bit more. To me, he felt like Liam 2.0. But the difference is, I want to care about Eli. His storyline should have been further explored from the beginning of the movie in scene 1 of Act 1, not 7 or 8 scenes into the movie, like I mentioned about Derrick. His chemistry with Derrick as his father doesn't match up and doesn't make sense on screen. They are awkward together. The histories of him being Derrick's son doesn't match up. He doesn't look like Derrick. He is awkward and clumsy. He is not really popular. He is a troublemaker. These are some of the things that Derrick was not when he was a teen himself. Derrick didn't play lacrosse. He was a star basketball player. Eli plays lacrosse and is pretty bad even though he is a werewolf in his block. But as I watched Eli in the movie, I couldn't help but to wonder who he reminded me of. Styles. Styles, even though he wasn't physically in the movie, his presence was heavily felt throughout, and so he sort of had a cameo in the movie. So there is hope he might appear if there is a second movie. His father being in the movie itself brought his presence to the movie. His Jeep that he left behind also brought his presence into the movie. And he was mentioned a couple of times in the movie. And he was also mentioned by Lydia for a stupid reason behind why they broke up in a dropped unexplored storyline where Lydia had a repeated dream of Styles dying. But what I couldn't happen to get my head around, I don't know if any of you noticed, is the similarities between Eli and Styles. Before you write me off, let me explain. Eli and Styles tie-in. First of all, they look like each other to their mannerisms, facial features to their awkwardness and clumsiness. Eli talks and makes jokes the same way as Styles did, and he can't help but take himself for a joyride in Styles' Jeep. Not to mention, he is also on the lacrosse team and is benched in the same way Styles was. And like Styles, he can hotwire a car and find trouble wherever he is. Eli's closeness and bond to the sheriff, Styles' father, is better than his bond with his own father, Derrick. They had great chemistry together, similar to the relationship Styles had with his father. Almost like the sheriff was his grandfather. Okay, so I know that's pushing it, but think about it. They didn't want to give him the Jeep for a reason. Forget the reason they came up with about Derrick taking the Jeep and fixing it up. That was a weak reasoning that didn't make practical sense to me. It was just uncharacteristic of Derrick to be that nostalgic over Styles' Jeep of all things. It doesn't make sense. Yeah, Derrick and Styles were close, but not that close. I'm not saying that Eli is in theory Styles' son, but wouldn't it be interesting if it was? That would be a great reasoning behind why Lydia and Styles really broke up, right? But who knows? This is, in my opinion, what I think really happened to explain why I'm seeing the similarities. I think, and I don't know, but in my own opinion, it was probably this: when the movie was announced, I think the production team originally planned Eli to be Styles' kid, originally. It would make perfect sense and bring it full circle to the franchise series if this was actually true. That's why, though, through 2.5 watches of the movie, something never sat well with me concerning the relationship between Eli and the Sheriff STILINSKY, because he was supposed to be his grandfather, but that's still just my opinion. Let me delve deeper into this explanation and theory. Well, in the series, we saw every other character turn supernatural or werewolf except Styles, excluding season 3 because he was possessed by the Nakasune for a short while. I think there was also mention on one of the seasons whether Scott should turn Styles into a werewolf. I don't think Styles wanted it. but it could make sense if he did have a son 15 years later who happened to turn into a werewolf per se, bitten just like Scott was in season 1, or even inherited from a werewolf-born mother, possibly. That could have made a good storyline in itself. And then there was the reason why this particular story scenario didn't happen is because for whatever reason, the STILES actor didn't want to be a part of it. So I'm not going to talk about that in this video, but the production team probably didn't want to throw out the whole story idea, so they made Eli instead Derrick's son, and that's why we see like still the residue of similarities between STILES and Eli. They probably didn't have time to rewrite Eli's characteristics to be similar with Derrick, and even though that's kind of sloppy writing, I'm talking from a writer's point of view of my own, it still kind of makes sense. But for now, on every time I see Eli in any upcoming Teen Wolf series or movie, I'll be thinking about style. What do y'all think about that? Leave your comments down below. Werewolf transformations. The one thing about Teen Wolf as a fan that I loved was the interesting transformations on the show. But one thing that I had wished they did on the show that they didn't do was hoping for a full werewolf transformation for the pack. But in the movie, that never happened either. The only one that truly transformed was Malia, and that was at the beginning of the movie, and it wasn't even pack related. When they did actually transform, it was in Act 3 for only a couple of scenes, and it wasn't even a full transformation. I was disappointed because instead we got a gross half transformation of the Nakasune turning into a werewolf creature. I didn't feel like he was even considered a werewolf. I was waiting especially when Scott was about to transform, but it never happened. When will we finally see that one? We will never know, I guess. Alternate storylines rewrites Teen Wolf the movie. Earlier, I mentioned that Derrick and Eli's storyline should have been either story A or story B, instead of where it was at story C. The reason why I say that is because Eli is the new Teen Wolf, so it would have made sense to give the mantle to Eli and let his storyline be the main focus. Allison and Scott's storyline be second or even story C. Eli and Derrick should have appeared at the start of Act 1 instead of his scene at the 17:36 mark. Eli should have appeared at the 8-minute and 40-second mark. By doing this, it would have set Derrick and Eli's character arc up smoothly and allowed us, the viewer, to get to know Eli better. As the viewer, we would have had more time for flashbacks from Derrick and Eli's past and what Derrick has been through as a father. Thus, they could have reintroduced the Nakasune towards the beginning of Act 2 and set him up as a threat from that point forward, while still having Argent somehow having visions of Allison and connecting with Scott in the first act, whereas Allison would still be resurrected in a similar way. Also, Scott's visions of Allison at that beginning could have been the opening scene and shot the one that we originally got, thus setting up the resurrection of Allison for the end of Act 1. Plot holes, questions, plus final thoughts. There was a lot of plot holes in this movie. The biggest plot hole I had was the 15-year time jump and the fact that humans knew about the werewolves and the supernatural, at least in Beacon Hills. This was appeared in season 6 when the humans found out about the werewolves, but it wasn't mentioned in the movies. Neither was the story plot where Scott and the rest of the pack was being chased by the woman, so they go and find other supernaturals. That was thrown out and not mentioned at all in the movie either. So I wish that was further explored, but when will that be further explored or talk about? Is that just a, did they retcon it or something? How did Derrick get off the FBI's radar since he was wanted and on the run in season 6? They just threw that out. What happened to the woman at the end of season 6 that was chasing them all? I forgot her name. Another plot hole is what happened to the teacher. How did he survive? Did he die and come back to life? It seemed like he died. I'm sorry. And if so, How did he come back to life? Because there's no way he could have survived. And why chase after? Once again, like, why chase after the pack? They didn't do nothing to him. And this is one of the things I'm wondering. Now that Allison is alive, what are the repercussions of Allison being alive after being dead for such a long time? And also, did Derrick really die? Another big plot hole that I was also concerned about was the relationship plot holes and explanations of breakups such as Lydia and Styles. It was weak. I did not like any of the new relationships. I did not particularly care about them. Allison and Scott getting back together should have not been the main focus of the movie. Like I said earlier, it should have been focused on Derrick and Eli. And so this was a big plot hole issue in the show, in the movie. I don't know why I keep saying show, because most people are saying it was basically a 2 episodes put together. But yeah, the plot holes of the relationships, I wanted to see why Lydia and Silas broke up more, and the explanation they gave didn't make sense. Parrish and Malia, why did that even happen? That didn't make sense. And Scott and Malia's breakup, they did not explain that. That was odd, and their chemistry with each other was awkward at the end. But yeah, so that's what I was concerned about. Also, another plot hole was, where's Eli's mother and where's Styles? If Allison being awoken is somewhat connected to the Nakasune, why wasn't she destroyed when the Nakasune was destroyed? Shouldn't she have died again since the Nakasune spell that brought her back to life? These are some of the questions I had about the movie and plot holes I saw within as well. Overall, once again, the movie was kind of jarring, and I really wanted to like it because I was waiting for this movie for a long time. Most importantly, I thought they were going to explore some of the things that they left us hanging on at the end of season 6. I would have loved to see some of the plot holes, plot lines explored further. And like I said earlier, since they kind of rebooted Teen Wolf and didn't continue with previous storylines, they should have just had most of the movie centered around Eli with Scott and Derrick handing down the mantle to him. But that unfortunately didn't happen. Some things I would love to see next time, if there is another movie or series, is Eli's background and present-day shenanigans further explored, Lydia's banshee powers further explored, the hellhound mythos expanded and explored, please. So that's all I had, but what do you think about the film itself as a whole? Is this what you expected for a Teen Wolf film? What could have been done better? What could have been explored? Let me know in the comments below. Let's start a dialogue about it. Next time's episode will be about an in-depth look on the White Wolf of the Hearts Mountains. None of you have probably never really heard about this short story. I didn't really hear about it a long time ago, recently. I recently just heard about it a year ago. It's a great werewolf short story. It's on the internet. Anybody can read it, but it's a great werewolf story, and I will be analyzing that the next podcast episode. So if you like this episode and you want to tune into next time's episode, like, subscribe, and share this episode. Leave your comments and suggestions for future podcasts. I would love to hear from you about that. So my Discovering the Blue Hour audio podcast is now exclusively free, only on discoveringthebluehour.com. If you want even more content, take a journey through the website, where you can discover all exclusive content pertaining to my work in progress werewolf novel. During the Blue Hour, there are short stories, important information about the podcast, blog posts, novel concept, videos, and more. Okay, thanks for listening, and see you next time.